Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, we're going to talk about, you guessed it, Season 1 episode of The Boys, entitled The Self-Preservation Society. So, there are only 8 episodes in The Boys Season 1, so we are nearing our end, you guys. I know a lot of folks have been upset with the pacing of the show, but I think that honestly, given the fact that the season is only 8 episodes long, they've done a stellar job in fleshing out the things that need to be fleshed out with these characters in order to tell the necessary Season 1 stories. This episode really gets us up to speed on who Billy Butcher really is, and also what's going on with Starlight as she moves forward in discovering the truth about her origins and stepping into her power on the hero's journey. To recap our last episode, episode 6 of Season 1 of The Boys, we found in the last episode that the reason Billy Butcher hates the Supes, all of them, but especially Homelander, is that Homelander sexually assaulted Butcher's wife, Rebecca, and that is why he's dedicating his life to taking down specifically Homelander, but also the Vought 7, and finally all Supes. So we're getting to see a little bit more about who Butcher was before all of this happened, before his wife disappeared. And now some of the things that he and Rachel have said also make more sense. We were introduced to Rachel in the last episode. She is Rebecca's sister and therefore Billy's sister-in-law. And we've heard her name before that point though, when Billy had the flashback or the dream of when he and his wife were still together and he was being asked to go see a concert that turned out to be a Spice Girls concert, and he said, "Take Rachel with you." Turns out Rachel is her sister. And knowing all of this now from the last episode really just makes me love Butcher that much more. He's not particularly wholesome right now, but back when he still had his wife and before everything went sideways, Butcher was really spending a lot of time with the woman he loved, and she wanted nothing more than to go to a Spice Girls concert with him, and he really did not want to go. But as we can tell from his conversation with Frenchie and MM, particularly the weird pep talk he gives them about the Spice Girls, we know that he really did care about his wife, and he cared about her interests because they were specific to her. Even though he puts on a show of arguing with her about not going to see it and trying to weasel his way out of it, I think that Billy probably did go to his fair share of Spice Girls concerts, and he listened enough to Rebecca going on about her favorite band, enough to really get that ingrained into his head, what each of the Spice Girls are doing now. This isn't childhood or teenage information that he's passing on from when they were pop culture sensations. This is recent information from the past 7 years or so. I find that to be particularly wholesome, not just for Billy in general, but because I've honestly dated a lot of people who are not at all into sci-fi or speculative fiction in general. So for me, seeing a man who really is getting into the things that his partner is into, even if they are not stereotypically masculine or something that they would readily admit to, is very wholesome to me. He clearly did not want to do the things, but he did them because he loved Rebecca so much. And I think that that's really beautiful. Call me a sap, you guys, if you want. I'm getting soft in my old age, but I'm just saying, I think that that aspect is really relationship goals. I like to take an interest in my partner's different things that they're into over the years, and that means I have watched a lot of things I have not really otherwise been interested in. But every now and then you find something that really resonates with you, but it also means that as you go through these different interest periods, you're exposed to things you might not otherwise be exposed to, whether that is music or a sport or anything really, television shows, etc. I have yet to meet a man who can convince me to watch The Wire or The Sopranos, but we do have a shared interest perhaps in this episode because it was directed by Dan Attias. I might be butchering his name and I'm very sorry. I've only seen it in print and never heard it pronounced. But the gentleman who directed this episode has also directed episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, so that's in my side of the Venn diagram, but also The Sopranos, somebody else's Venn diagram side. 6 Feet Under, I love that show. Back to my Venn diagram. The Wire, their Venn diagram. Lost, my Venn diagram again. And then The Americans, as well as Miami Vice. So mostly other people's Venn diagrams. But if we go ahead and overlap these and we just put in TV shows with Dan Attias as the director, then you might be able to convince me to watch something I might not otherwise. After all, Amanda Tapping directing some episodes of Anne with an E, which is about Anne of Green Gables, has me considering watching Anne of Green Gables, y'all. That's not typically in my wheelhouse, but I'm really thinking about it because she's one of my favorite directors, and I would be really interested to see how she would direct something like that is non-sci-fi. So every now and then you have something that overlaps with your partner's interests, and even if you don't particularly love it, just seeing how much they love it and how much joy they get out of you seemingly caring for this. And it doesn't have to be a lie that you care about it. Billy was like, Rebecca, I really don't want to do this. Please go with Rachel. And she's like, I don't want to go with Rachel. I want to go with you. It can really be a big deal to see how happy your partner gets when they get to experience the thing they love with you. That's something I love with my friends and with partners, is just seeing people's eyes light up when they talk about something that they're excited about. And I think that that love of seeing that in other people is one of the things that is in the Venn diagram mandorla of me and Billy Butcher, particularly when it comes to partners. You don't have to love it yourself to love how much your partner loves something. I know that that is something small about this show, but it's something that really resonated with me from my personal perspective. It's not going to be what everyone gets out of it, but that's the cool thing about art, you guys, is it's largely subjective and different people are going to get different things out of it. My review of The Boys is not going to look the same as if Keith did it or if anyone else out there did it. They're all going to be a little bit different. And I know that this is perhaps more feminine of a perspective than a lot of our viewers would necessarily be into, but I love wholesome masculinity, y'all, and I am here for it. Love your partners and try to experience some of the things that they are interested in. Sometimes it very well may surprise you how much you enjoy it too. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about what happens in more of these flashbacks as the story unfolds. Stay tuned. You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about learning more about Billy Butcher and his love of his wife, Rebecca, before her untimely disappearance. We don't know if she's actually dead. Her family, like her sister Rachel and her mother, seem to think so, but Billy is not quite ready to let go, even about 8 years in. In this episode, we do get to learn some more about Rebecca Butcher, though, and Billy as a person. We get to see a really cute flashback to Rebecca in the Vaught Christmas party 8 years ago, shortly before she disappeared. In this scene, we already know ultimately what happens to Rebecca Butcher. And it gives you just this overarching sense of unease because we know that Homelander ultimately ends up sexually assaulting her and that somehow plays into her disappearance, whether that be because Homelander killed her or she killed herself, as her sister Rachel really believes. But we also know that this is Billy's motive. So in one aspect, we can kind of look at this as Rebecca having been fridged. So we've spoken in previous episodes about Gail Simone's Women in Refrigerators, but this is kind of how it seems so far. We have this off-screen wife who was killed just to give our main anti-hero, or one of our main anti-heroes, the overarching purpose and plot of this entire storyline. On the other hand, I want to also talk about how art imitates life. Going into this knowing already that Rebecca Butcher is ultimately assaulted by Homelander in a sexual manner gives this entire nicety that he portrays up to this point really an unsettling quality. It is very much a feeling of being in the presence of a monster that is able to camouflage itself. And that is something that is very relevant to the experience of anyone whom has ever experienced a sexual assault. Remember, as we discussed in previous episodes, that there's this concept of people can be more than one thing, Joel, and it works in both directions. People who are terrible to certain people can also seem very kind and considerate to others in different contexts. And people who otherwise seem like kind, considerate, upstanding citizens, or even protectors of others, like Homelander in this instance, can be someone else's absolute true nightmare. After all, if all monsters were instantly recognizable, then we wouldn't really have a problem with all of these monsters, right? If all monsters had purple skin, then we would know ahead of time that all purple people were not great, and we would be able to head that off at the pass. It's just not something that is readily available to people. Normally, people get you into these compromising positions because they can come across as being a really genuine or kind person in different contexts, and then completely turn on you in others. It's not like absolutely everyone thought that Harvey Weinstein was a predator in all contexts. A lot of folks really thought that he was genuinely trying to help them out, and that it was just going to be a casual conversation. And then he assaulted so many women. And that's true for not just people in entertainment. That is true of a lot of sexual predators specifically. The same thing goes for a lot of domestic abusers. I'm actually going to give you the numbers from RAINN right now, and RAINN is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. It's an anti-sexual violence organization, and they collect statistics as well as have a number for a hotline to help people. 8 out of 10 rapes are actually committed by someone who is known by the victim. 39% of these are committed by an acquaintance. 33% are committed by a current or former spouse, boyfriend, or girlfriend. So 72% of rapes are committed by someone that the person already knows. And 6% are committed by more than one person or the victim cannot remember. 19.5% are committed by a stranger, and 2.5% are committed by a non-spouse relative. So really that takes that 72% up to 74.5%. Or if we follow classic rounding rules, 75% of sexual violence encounters are committed by people who are already known by the victim. And a lot of folks tend to speak in favor of these folks who have committed these violent sex crimes. And they do so perhaps in totally good faith, not really believing that this person could possibly be someone else's monster. But that's the thing about a lot of sexual predators. They are really good at social camouflage. at blending into their surroundings, and it being more than one thing, Joel. This is thoroughly illustrated with Homelander in these episodes, but we also see this happen with the Deep in this episode. The theme of sexual assault and victimization is very strong within this series. Whether the victimization be the nature of collateral damage of having superheroes, or whether it be something like the Deep forcing himself on Starlight via coercion, or Homelander on Becca Butcher via actual physical force. At least we're led to believe that it's actual physical force, given the state of Becca's clothing and everything after she leaves the room. It really comes back to the concept that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that is true in the case of folks like Homelander and the Deep, or even folks in real life like Harvey Weinstein, who had so much power over people's careers and whether or not they were blacklisted in Hollywood and whether their dreams would be crushed, much like Starlight and the Deep, that he was able to coerce or even physically force people into these terrible acts of sexual violence, and was also then able to get away with blacklisting anyone who tried to step forward. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss some more of these themes, including male sexual assault. Stay tuned. You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco, ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Before the break, we were we're discussing the theme of sexual violence and victimization in general in the show The Boys. I understand that oftentimes it can be an unpalatable conversation, but The Boys clearly thinks that that is a conversation that needs to be had, and I would be remiss to not address it in my review of the show. So far we have talked about sexual violence against women, but now I want to talk about sexual violence against men. So RAINN also gives us statistics for sexual violence against men, and they found that 1 out of every 10 rape victims are male, and about 3% of American men, or 1 in 33, have experienced an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. As of 1998 alone, 2.78 million men in the United States had reported being victims of attempted or completed rape. This also affects non-binary transgender folks, too. So 21% of transgender, genderqueer, and non-conforming college students have been sexually assaulted, compared to 18% of non-transgender, genderqueer, or non-conforming females, and 4% of non-transgender, genderqueer, or non-conforming males. 94% of women who were raped experienced symptoms of PTSD during the 2 weeks following the rape. 30% of women report those symptoms of PTSD 9 months afterwards. 33% of women who are raped contemplate suicide, and 13% of women who are raped attempt suicide. About 70% of rape or sexual assault victims experience moderate to severe distress, which is a far larger percentage than for any other type of violent crime. People who have been sexually assaulted are also more likely to use drugs than the general public. They are 3.4 times more likely to use marijuana, 6 times more likely to use cocaine, and 10 times more likely to use, quote, other major drugs, unquote. This also has far-reaching social repercussions. It can impact your relationship with your family, your friends, and your coworkers. So I think that it's very important that they take this approach in discussing sexual assault in this show. And it is very much a theme, as unpopular as it may be. We have a different experience with Starlight versus with The Deep versus with Becca Butcher. They all deal with it very differently, and you see how it reaches out and affects their family members. It affects Billy and Rachel and Rebecca's mother. It affects Starlight to the point that she can't keep her PR goggles on anymore, and she's just raw about it. Which reminds me in a way of Rose McGowan. But while Starlight is celebrated within the show for being honest about what happened, Rose McGowan was instead blacklisted from a lot of Hollywood. Remember when we say that absolute power corrupts absolutely, we are talking about people who are in power. There is a power dynamic at play. And they are able to get rid of some headlines. They're able to throw their weight around and suppress the truth in many ways, no matter which realm they're in. Whether that be politics or Hollywood, or in this case, the weird conglomeration that is being a superhero. In The Boys, it is religious and political and authoritarian, and also corporate. It's a lot of different realms all at once, and in that way it is holistic and all-encompassing of a lot of the experiences that folks in real life have. It is another example in this theme of sexual assault, of art imitating life. That is why it fits very well that Rachel thinks that her sister probably committed suicide if Homelander hadn't killed her himself. And so on the one hand, we can look at Rebecca Butcher as being a fridged character, there to have had something terrible happen to her just to further Billy Butcher's story. But I don't really feel that that's the case with Rebecca Butcher, because it's not just about Billy, it's also about Rachel and her mom, even though her mom is off screen. And I think that they do a really good job in this story of showing the pervasive, far-reaching outcomes of an act of sexual violence perpetrated against another. It seems very well informed, in my opinion, and like they have perhaps really done their research on this. It would make sense if Rebecca had attempted suicide in this context, since 1/3 of women who have been raped contemplate suicide, and 13% actually attempt it. So it may be tempting to write Rebecca Butcher off as being fridged, like Gwen Stacy or Alexandra DeWitt, for whom this was really named for in the Green Lantern storyline. So in Green Lantern number 54, that came out in 1994, Kyle Rayner came home and found his girlfriend, Alexandra DeWitt, had been killed by Major Force and been shoved into the refrigerator. And this was really meant to be not about Alexandra at all, but about how they can move the male character's story arc forward. They didn't really care about fully developing the female character. She could have been a lamp for all that it mattered. She could have been Kyle Rayner's favorite lamp that was destroyed instead, and that would spur him on to really confront Major Force. It's something that is problematic in comics, but it's something that is important to talk about, I think. If you're interested in women in refrigerators, you can also go check out Gail Simone's website, and it has some really interesting discussions about comic books. Gwen Stacy was similarly killed because they were at the point in that storyline where Spider-Man and Gwen Stacy were really on a path to get married. And they decided that, quote, no one wants a married Spider-Man, unquote. And so they killed her and really replaced her with Mary Jane. So Gwen Stacy was also fridged, although she was not literally stuffed in a fridge like Alexandra DeWitt was. But I don't think that that's the case with Rebecca Butcher. I think that we get these flashbacks now to really see why Billy is the way he is. And they kept it to themselves in this storyline long enough for us to really get to know Billy and then get to know why he is the way he is. And we're getting to know him through these flashbacks with Rebecca. It's not just him explaining who Becca was. It's us really getting to see who they were together and how he was different before. So I really enjoyed the way that they tell this story. And even from a feminist perspective, I really liked it. I know that stating the F word so brazenly like that might not be super popular with some of you, but you guys, I am a woman and I do care about issues that affect women. I also am a huge superhero and comic geek and a speculative fiction geek in general. So I like to see how I'm represented in media as well. This is really interesting to me, and I actually really like how they handle it in The Boys. They go at it from different perspectives as to how women handle this, and we have a male character experiencing this as well. It's overall very holistic. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about Mallory. Stay tuned.
Watch Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were expounding upon the theme of sexual assault and victimization within the boys in general, but specifically as it relates to Rebecca Butcher and whether or not we really consider her to be fridged. I don't necessarily. So now we're going to talk about meeting Mallory. So we have heard about Mallory so far, mostly as Frenchie and MM have fought about how Frenchie went off mission in their mission against the lamplighter, and they were supposed to kill him, but rather than kill him, Frenchie let him go, believing that perhaps Lamplighter was better than he truly was, only for Lamplighter to torture Mallory's grandkids to death. Now, first up, I really love that Mallory is an older woman. Mallory is BA, y'all. And she's the one who really brought the boys together. It's not her children who died, but rather her grandchildren. We don't get a ton of really baller roles like this for older women in the media. One of my favorites is actually Helen Mirren in Red and all of those movies. She is absolutely amazing, and I love Dame Helen Mirren. She also played an ex-MI6 assassin in Hobbs & Shaw 2019, which is part of the Fast and Furious franchise, which I'm also a huge fan of, even if it's not sci-fi. But beyond her and Dame Judi Dench playing Q in some of the James Bond movies that are more recent, we don't really get a lot of older ladies in action roles in Hollywood. So I really enjoyed that Mallory was so much older than a lot of the other characters in this show. Turns out Mallory's her last name. Her name is Grace Mallory, and she's played by Layla Robbins, and she is who brought the boys together. And we see that she initially approached Butcher with security camera footage of Becca coming out of an office and explaining that Becca had been in that room with Homelander for 3 hours, and that is likely what led to her disappearance ultimately. It's honestly Butcher's origin story, so it might feel a little late in the series to tell an origin story, but in true comic book fashion, I don't think so. I really like that we get to know him before we get to know his motivations. It's just like getting to know a friend in real life. But this is also the moment that we're seeing that Butcher realized that heroes were not entirely heroic just by the virtue of being given that label, and that he was thusly recruited into this superhero resistance. Later on, we really see that this is kind of an Obi-Wan Kenobi situation, and there is a version of the truth about what happened with Rebecca Butcher through a scene that occurs with Homelander and one of the scientists who helped create and raise him, Dr. Vogelbaum. So, Jonah Vogelbaum is talking to Homelander and is really kind of upset with him. Homelander's finally figured out that it is Rebecca Butcher's husband who is leading the team that is seeking him out. And he's also learning what really happened to Becca Butcher. So Homelander has now figured out, hey, this is the face of the person or the people who are after you, thanks to the photos that Mesmer gave him on his phone. And he's confronting his creator, more or less, with this information. So after the sexual assault, the rape led to a pregnancy by Homelander. Up to this point, everyone thought that Supes were sterile. So no one thought this was possible. But when Rebecca was found to be pregnant, they forced her to sign an NDA and have the baby in secret and tell no one, including her husband. And that's why she disappeared. But as Vogelbaum tells it, the child tore its way out of her stomach and killed her. And so both died on the table. He tells Homelander that the baby drowned in its mother's own blood. But it is very suspect the way that he tells the story. So we see that Homelander is using these photos from Mesmer to tell what exactly has happened. He calls a meeting with the Seven and shows the pictures of each of them and accuses Annie of participating in this with Huey to actively dismantle the Seven and help kill Translucent and send off the Deep. So Annie is very shocked at this point, and you can tell that she's genuinely surprised. She is not seeing this coming, and she and Huey have recently, as far as we could tell, consummated their relationship, and she's been so happy. He's been one of her few rocks in this wild new life that she's been leading. And she's very hurt by the accusation and also the possibility that Huey could have betrayed her so. She's truly reeling right now. And Maeve actually stands up for her at this point. Queen Maeve stands up right as Homelander looks like he's about to laser her, as he would put it, and tells him, look, she obviously didn't know. Look how she's reacting right now. You know that she clearly did not know. This is not something that she actively participated in, and it's problematic that you're trying to punish her for it. Stop it. Maeve is the only one with the cojones necessary to stand up to him at this point. And it is very apparent. But he's also becoming bolder because he actually ridicules Maeve for it. He doesn't pull another one of those, see, that's what I love about you, Maeve. This time he goes, oh wow, you really must have pulled something over on Maeve, because I can't remember the last time she cared about literally anything. And he throws her affectation of not caring about anything back in her face, as though to say, I've known this about you absolutely all along, and have just been playing a part. It's a little chilling, and you're not sure if he's going to go ahead and zap Maeve and Annie where they stand, or if he's going to let it slide. But ultimately, he lets it slide, although he threatens them both by stating that he is going to hold Maeve responsible for how Annie acts going forward. I know that a lot of folks are upset that Annie does not immediately go and confront Huey about having used her for this, and that it's A-Train, in fact, who beats her to the punch. But I think that it also makes a lot of sense. Personally, I like to think things through thoroughly before acting, especially when I'm hurt. There is a quote by Ambrose Bierce that says, "Speak when you're angry, and you will make the best speech you will ever regret." So personally, I get it. I like to process my emotions, to think through my emotions, really, and settle down before I decide on a course of action. I want to make sure that I am proceeding intellectually with thought, rather than just with emotions. And that's not to negate emotions or say that they aren't important, but rather to also take the considerations regarding how I want to come across and what might be most effective, and how I might harm others or myself by just reacting rather than thinking through it and being proactive rather than reactive. So this really doesn't bother me. For me, especially as a woman and as a woman who is the way that I am, I recognize this as Annie just thinking through everything. She is upset and she is hurt, but she needs to process things first. Everyone is different. Each of us are individuals, and so we have these different intersections of how we deal with things. And in Annie's case, she needs to think it through. She has a discussion with Queen Maeve about it and asks Queen Maeve to make her a drink as well. And they discuss what's really going on with this outcome. It's something that tells us a lot about Maeve too. Yes, Annie is in shock, but Maeve explains to her, look, we don't have human vulnerabilities. You can't just walk up and shoot us and kill us. Our vulnerabilities are internal. They are the people that we care about. And so that's why you have to distance yourself from everyone that you care about. Because if you care about someone and it becomes known, and it ultimately will become known, then those people are at risk. And in this interaction, although we're led to believe initially that it's about Annie, it is telling us why Queen Maeve broke up with her ex-girlfriend and left her behind in her life, even though Maeve clearly still has strong feelings for her and is still one of the few people that Queen Maeve truly trusts. It's just not safe for her, and that's why Maeve was so hurt when her ex-girlfriend told her to go back to Homelander. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about A-Train's interaction with Huey's dad. Stay tuned.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing Annie's conversation with Maeve, following finding out that Huey and Butcher were the ones behind the assault on the Seven and Translucent's death. Maeve has decided to take responsibility for Annie in light of Homelander wanting to kill her and or torture her. That was not entirely clear. But we find that ultimately A-Train is the one who confronts Huey first. So A-Train decides to use essentially what Maeve is listing to Annie as being the soup's weakness. And that is going to Huey's dad first and using him to force Huey to come speak with him. A-Train threatens Huey's dad and forces Huey to come back to the house. So when they have this conversation, Huey's dad is more or less none the wiser, but ultimately we end up with Huey against Butcher and the others' guidance, wanting to come back to the house. And A-Train tells him that if he doesn't come alone, he's more or less going to kill his father. So when Huey shows up, apparently actually alone, A-Train is very amused because he thinks that Huey is an idiot for having shown up alone. However, he goes along with his plan. And A-Train at first seems to kind of make a good point, because he talks about how killing Robin and exploding her into more or less pink mist was an accident. It was a mistake. But what Huey did to Popclaw in blackmailing her to get information about the Compound V was actually very intentional, and that ultimately that makes Huey, at least in part, responsible for Popclaw's death. And that's true, but Huey did not force A-Train to kill her. And indeed, Huey and the rest of the boys had no way of knowing how extensive and pervasive this Compound V issue was at the time. They had no way of knowing that Homelander would ultimately order A-Train, or even someone else, to kill Popclaw for talking. They just saw a tragedy and exploited it as an opportunity, which is truly really not different from what the Supes do on the daily. Except in this case, with Popclaw ultimately dying, it was one of the Supes' own. Honestly, all they really did was turn the tables on the status quo. But the status quo, and in this instance particularly A-Train, did not really like it. Again, people only tend to care about different problems in the world around them when those problems directly impact them. So in this case, A-Train was finally personally impacted by a tragedy being exploited as an opportunity. And so now he cares. But he certainly did not care, and even laughed when explaining to the Supes in the Soup nightclub that he busted through Robin so fast that he accidentally swallowed one of her molars and likened it to being a bug on the windshield. He doesn't really feel remorse for this, and in fact, he is just making excuses for his own problems. This is not necessarily something he intentionally did, but it is his fault, and it is his responsibility. He's claiming none of that, though, while simultaneously blaming Huey for something that is Huey's fault, because Huey did participate in blackmailing Popclaw. But ultimately, it's really just turning the Soup status quo on its head. And no one really appreciates when they are treated the way that they treat other people, honestly. I've seen a meme that says that people treat you the way that you want to be treated, and then they treat you the way that you treat them. And in this case, that really seems to hold true for the Supes. The Supes were just treating people however they felt like, and the folks who were regular people, like Huey and the others, were really treating them with a sense of reverence. They were treating them with the platinum rule, treating them better than they would want or expect to be treated. But once Huey and Butcher and the other boys really see the Supes for what they are, then they start treating them the way that they know they treat other people. I think that's a powerful message combined with Will Smith's lesson on fault versus responsibility, where certain things might happen to you in your life, and they might not be your fault, but how you handle the outcome is truly your responsibility. You don't want to lay that shadow onto other people. You need to be dealing with that yourself. And that means, even talking to a therapist, you don't have to necessarily deal with it alone. But you can't just make it someone else's problem when that person is unwilling or unwittingly helping you. You want to make sure that you have the consent of the person who is assisting you. So a person like a therapist is a good outlet for those problems. And that's really where A-Train's argument really falls to pieces. So he is blaming Huey completely for this, but he's taking no responsibility in initially exposing Popclaw to Compound V to begin with. He's the one who set all of this into motion, and he's refusing to take accountability for any of his actions, including not being honest with her about Stillwell and her willingness to let them go public with being a couple, versus how he is expected to portray his brand. He's also not taking accountability for letting her know about Compound V and exposing her to and perhaps even encouraging or enabling her to use this drug as well, which is ultimately what led to her accidentally killing the landlord. Now, that's not to say that Popclaw is faultless in any of this. She's not. She is a grown woman, and she made her own decisions out of an emotional place instead of thinking through what she needed to think through. She just made an emotional decision to numb the pain away by taking the Compound V when she saw her boyfriend tell everyone that he was single. Not only did they not get to go public, which is something he had promised her before, but at this event he told everyone he was in fact single. So she made this emotional decision of, instead of breaking up with him, she was going to do something petty and do drugs and get vengeance and sleep with someone else. It was not a great decision, but it was a decision that she ultimately made and that she is ultimately responsible for. Whereas A-Train deciding to lie to her about Stillwell perhaps being okay with it is something that is on him. And A-Train giving her access to and information about Compound V is also on A-Train. So he's laying his shadow really on Huey because he is just torn apart that he is ultimately, in some fashion, partly at least responsible for the death of his lover. And ultimately, he is totally responsible for it, as he ended up killing her by his own hands, by injecting her with an overdose of what appeared to be heroin at Homelander's orders. But Homelander isn't someone that A-Train can fight, and so instead of a problem-focused coping mechanism, he is using an emotion-focused coping mechanism. And if you would like to learn more about the differences between those, we have some episodes on the Health and Wellness podcast regarding those differences. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about where this leaves Huey and ultimately Billy Butcher.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing A-Train and Huey's confrontation at Huey's dad's house, and the concepts of fault versus responsibility. Now we're going to talk about the outcome of this confrontation and what happens with Butcher. So ultimately we find that Huey didn't force A-Train to kill Popclaw. Rather, that was Homelander. But since Homelander is ultimately someone that no one thinks they can fight against, including A-Train and including the deputy director of the CIA, Susan. Everyone is scared of this person, and so they are laying blame anywhere elsewhere that they can. So Huey is in this kind of gray area. he did technically use Popclaw, just as he technically used Annie, but he is unsettled in both of these situations by the actions he's taken, just as he was in his situation with Ezekiel. So Butcher, though, seems completely chill with this entire process. He is absolutely enraged when he confronts Mesmer for giving the photos to Homelander on his phone. And it's kind of startling. Butcher knew that Homelander and the others would find the boys at some point. Remember, he established that in the episode after they killed Translucent, in which he took those zinc containers and he spray painted "coming for you" on the inside of them. He knew they were only going to be delayed, but would ultimately find them. Mesmer just sped that up, but it was something that would inevitably happen. So there's really not a huge reason for Billy to freak the way that he does. Mesmer also offers to tell Billy the truth about Becca, and Butcher goes ahead and holds Mesmer's hand. Mesmer is absolutely horrified by what he sees in Billy's mind. And then Butcher violently kills him in, I think it's an airport bathroom, by bashing his head against the sink repeatedly. It's very, very violent. But in that way, it is truly consistent with the source material of the comics. And in that manner, it's on brand, you guys. It's also something that shows that so far, Billy hasn't been the type of character to just murder people out of vengeance. Billy normally just kills people who are actively trying to hurt him and others around them. Like how he is most doggedly going after Homelander, even if he thinks that all soups are garbage. He has a prime opportunity in episode 6 to more or less kill what he would consider to be a baby Hitler. But he tells the baby instead, even though the infant is in the NICU and can't understand him, that he better keep his nose clean or that Billy's going to come back for him. So Billy can save himself a lot of heartache and a lot of effort by just killing this baby now. But he's somehow beyond that. However, it just takes a really dark turn at this point when he goes off on Mesmer and smashes him to death. So it's kind of more of the comic book version of Billy than it is the actual TV show. And in that way, it seems kind of like a departure. But who knows what all Mesmer actually saw when he looked into Billy's mind. There's no telling what kind of darkness he actually experienced. We've seen Billy do some messed up stuff and be super pumped about it in the past few episodes, so one can only imagine the things he has done in the past, either gleefully or ruefully. So the 7 want to get the boys, but before they can, Susan, the deputy director of the CIA, and more or less Butcher's friend, gets to them first. And they take all of the evidence back to their offices and put the families of the 7 into witness protection. And this is the point when we see that MM's old lady isn't just his girlfriend. He is married and he has a daughter who is probably 7, 8 years old or so. She's not anywhere near newborn, and he has been keeping that from them the entire time. It also makes a lot more sense as to why he's so upset when Frenchie goes off mission, and particularly why he is perturbed regarding the outcome with Mallory's grandkids. He has a family of his own at this point to really care for and to make sure that nothing like that happens to them. So we are kind of glad when Susan comes in and says they're going to help out. And then Stillwell comes in to talk. They really kind of require her to come in. And they tell them that Vought either has to drop that military bill that's going through Congress, or the CIA is going to let everything that they've been doing go public. Madeline seems to know that she's kind of boned, but then Susan gets called into the other room and sees that Navy SEALs have found the men behind the hijacking of the plane and killed them. But there is a guy who walked in with a tattoo on his chest and exploded, killing all the soldiers before walking out of the compound and being totally fine. So now there's literally a super terrorist, a super villain terrorist in this other country. And up till now, the US have been the only ones with super anything. So they know that Vought and the military are going to have to work together. And it doesn't really matter ultimately that Vought are the bad guys. It doesn't matter how the super terrorists were derived. The fact of the matter is that no amount of the American military industrial complex as it currently stands with missiles and tanks and what have you will be able to take down these new super terrorists. At the end of this episode, we do get to see Annie confront Huey. And she's very unhappy with him, but he is honest about the Compound V. And Annie seems truly upset by this and truly surprised, just like she was when Homelander ambushed her with the fact that Huey had been using her this entire time. And she explains to him, no, I mean, I grew up in the circuit and there is no way. Heroes are just born this way. And this is just a really bad news bears time for Annie. Her coworkers, except for Maeve, are all against her, but Maeve is still kind of being Maeve, y'all. She's giving her good advice, but she's more of an older sister who only kind of cares about you rather than being like a cool aunt who's watching out for you. Maeve is just not really all in when it comes to protecting Annie, and she also understands that by protecting Annie, it may actually put Annie at more risk because it means that Homelander might really take more of an interest in Annie as a way to hurt Maeve. But Annie is ultimately reckoning with the fact that her boyfriend and maybe her entire life have all been a lie, just a series of terrible lies. And as she's about to take Huey into custody and put him under arrest, she gets shot in the chest. Now, we've seen Homelander shoot Maeve in the chest before now, and we know that ultimately Annie should be just fine, but it's still startling to see. We do see, though, that it is Butcher who did it, and Butcher gets hold of Huey and tells him to get the heck out of Dodge. They run off together. And really, was Huey safer with Annie or is he safer with Butcher? Who knows at this point? I know going into custody and being exposed to Homelander would not be a great idea, but really, also, he's just as likely to get into some crazy shenanigans with Butcher as anything else. Overall, this is a really great episode. I briefly mentioned how the Deep is sexually assaulted at one point. It's a really disturbing component, and I think that's really the point, is it's meant to be disturbing. I felt that turning the tables on him was a little bit ham-fisted, especially since he was so strong, but that really is probably the point they were trying to make with how sometimes men are victimized even though they're perceived to be stronger, and folks don't really tend to listen to them in those situations. Perhaps he felt that she would also report him and try to flip it around, and in that way he felt coerced. Overall, I think they did a really great job on this episode and showing a myriad of aspects of victimization and sexual assault amongst all of the other themes. I really liked this episode. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask you to please subscribe to the show and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please like us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts SciFi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.